One of the most requested stories I get is that of Bryce Hospital in Alabama. The abandoned building that used to be a state mental asylum is said to be one of Alabama's most haunted locations. And I will admit, I've avoided the subject for a while now for personal reasons. I have a collection of letters from my great-grandfather, Obadiah Smith, who was a patient there in the 1940s and 50s, and who ultimately died within the walls of Bryce Hospital. The letters themselves don't allude to much of anything there that contributes to today's presentation, though. They just largely show a hope, desire, and repeated request to be able to come home. Still, though, I guess maybe I was always scared as to what I might find. But after reading through those letters again, and having family members ultimately letting me have them, I decided to take a proper look at Bryce Hospital. And I learned something that challenges the vast amount of reports and coverage out there from the ghost and haunting communities. Sure, Bryce Hospital has a dark past, as with any other mental asylum of the day. But as far as the ghost stories that draw people into the abandoned location, well, it may be a bit darker than the history of Bryce Hospital, because, to be blunt, the site isn't Bryce Hospital. If you're gonna go around and try to stir up the spirits of the past at an abandoned location charged with that much negative energy, at least know where you're going. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. In 1852, the state of Alabama began drafting plans for a state mental hospital, and construction began a year later, completing 6 years later in 1859. Additional indoor furnishings and all took another 2 years, and in 1861, the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane opened for business. It was a 268-bed hospital for committed patients and a separate facility with 100 beds for elderly care. And it was even the first building in Tuscaloosa with indoor gas lighting and central heat. The institute later changed its name to Bryce Hospital, named after the hospital's first superintendent, Peter Bryce, a 27-year-old pioneer in psychiatric care from South Carolina. Bryce himself was brought to the attention of the hospital trustee board by the building's designer, Dorothea Dix, a nurse and advocate for the mentally ill. The hospital itself was designed in, quote, moral architecture, a term used in the 19th century where the flow of the buildings and designs were thought to be a therapeutic tool to guide patients' behavior, instill order, and promote a calm, rational environment conducive to recovery. A type of experimental feng shui, I guess, is a way to look at it. Dorothea Dix herself helped design 32 state mental hospitals across the United States, as well as more than 30 internationally. Her work in advocacy for human treatment and lobbying for the rights and ethical treatment of mental patients put her in the forefront of mental health in the 19th century. Peter Bryce became the first superintendent of the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane at the recommendation of Dorothea Dix herself. Bryce had studied mental health care in Europe before going on to work at hospitals in New Jersey and South Carolina before making the move to Alabama. Bryce was known to run a tight ship, putting the care of patients above all else. The use of restraints and straitjackets were strongly discouraged, then ultimately banned by Bryce altogether in 1882. He instituted different work programs and activities for patients, things such as farming, sewing, maintenance, and crafts. There was even a time frame of about 10 years where patients wrote, edited, and published their own newspaper called The Meteor, which gained a pretty good following as it offered a rare glimpse into the life of a mental hospital to its readers. The Alabama State Hospital for the Insane gained national recognition in its commitment and treatment of its patients. But as with anything else, things change with time. As things moved into the 20th century, what was now called Bryce Hospital had become more of what we know of the typical insane asylums of the day. The standards that had been put in place by Peter Bryce were a thing of the past, and even though the hospital population continued to grow, the standards of the hospital continuously dropped. The state of things at Bryce Hospital was first brought to the public largely in 1967 by Alabama Governor Lurleen Wallace, when she was moved to tears when a 9-year-old patient clung to her leg, crying "Mama." In 1970, Alabama was ranked dead last in funding for mental health, and at the time, Bryce Hospital had ballooned to 5,200 patients. The newspaper Montgomery Advertiser compared the living conditions at Bryce Hospital to that of a concentration camp. Taxes that were appropriated for mental health treatment were cut off, and over 100 employees at Bryce were laid off. In October of 1970, Mildred Hunter Rawlins filed a lawsuit on behalf of her nephew, Ricky Wyatt, who was housed at Bryce Hospital despite having no mental illness diagnosis. Rawlins herself was one of the employees that had been laid off, and the lawsuit outlined the conditions and treatment that had begun to plague Bryce Hospital. In 1971, the lawsuit was expanded into a class action lawsuit and included other patients from Bryce Hospital, as well as patients from Searcy Hospital, the Partlow State School, and the Jemison Center. The ongoing court battle, which lasted until 2003, ended up setting national standards for people with mental illness or developmental disabilities in institutions. The agreement met throughout the court battles became known as the Wyatt Standards, a nationwide standard that are founded on 4 criteria of care: a humane psychological and physical environment, qualified and sufficient staff for the administration of treatment, individual treatment plans, and minimum restrictions of patient freedom. It became the longest-lasting case in the U.S. involving mental health. The case took 33 years to conclude. Afterward, on December 30th, 2009, then-Governor Bob Riley announced that Bryce Hospital would be relocated to a new facility, and that the University of Alabama would take over ownership of the old Bryce Hospital property. Existing patients were relocated to the new Bryce Hospital location, which continued to operate even today. The University of Alabama vowed to clean up the grounds of the old property and restore the hospital, and they did. Today, the former Old Bryce Hospital operates as the University of Alabama's Smith Family Center for the Performing Arts, with a section inside set apart as the Bryce Hospital Museum. But I know what you're thinking. That's not right. The internet is flooded with pictures and videos of the abandoned Old Bryce Hospital, with tales of it being one of Alabama's most haunted locations. Well, there is an abandoned location there, decrepit, fallen in, and nearly reclaimed by nature herself. And there are ample accounts of spirits of former staff and patients, mysterious footsteps, sounds of doors opening and closing. So, what's up with that? Has the internet been lying to us? No, not really. The lore on the internet has been whitewashed though, and over time it's just been accepted as truth from those that don't really dig into the stories. The site that all these articles and videos point to as Old Bryce Hospital is not the former site of Bryce Hospital, but rather the Jemison Center. People refer to it as Old Bryce Hospital, but that was a separate building altogether. The Jemison Center, as we briefly mentioned earlier with the class action lawsuit, is located in Northport, Alabama, about a mile or so outside of Tuscaloosa. The Jemison Center was opened in 1939 and operated through until 1977. It got its name from Confederate Senator and businessman Robert Jemison Jr. After his death in 1871, he left his largest plantation, known as the Cherokee Place, to the State of Alabama Board of Mental Health. Much of this land became the site of Bryce Hospital, but the building known as the Jemison Center, which opened in 1939, was due to the segregation era of the South. The Jemison Center was constructed for the African American patients, and they were moved to the new location when the Jemison Center opened in 1939. Those patients had previously been housed in the lofts of a storage barn on the Bryce Hospital campus. The Jemison Center, or what was originally named the Alabama State Farm Colony for Negroes, was largely governed by Bryce Hospital and adapted the same concept that work, crafts, and meaning could aid to the patient's care and recovery. The work given to those at the Jemison Center, though, was to tend the fields around campus, forced to work on farm plots that helped to sustain the growing number of patients across Bryce Hospital. By the 1960s, though, labor on these types of institutions became a point of public concern. A lot of people began to realize that rather than working on any type of recovery or rehabilitation, patients were being kept at these institutions long term as a source of free labor. In 1970, with public scrutiny from the Wyatt lawsuit, the Jemison Center made headlines when the Tuscaloosa News secretly gained access to the Jemison Center. The newspaper reported that feces caked the toilets and walls, and the floors were urine-soaked and sagging. Almost all beds had no linen at all, and many patients were found sleeping on those same dirty floors. There were only 2 showers, one for the 131 male patients, and another for the 75 female patients. Most of the patients that day had appeared to not have bathed in days, and all of them were highly tranquilized. The reporter documented all that he could, but ultimately reported that he left quickly without surveying the entire building because the stench was unbearable. The Jemison Center was forced to shut down in 1977, well before the conclusion of the Wyatt case. Perhaps that is part of the reason its history is shadowed by Bryce Hospital. With the location being what it was, on top of being a former site of a plantation, many speculate that there are lost slave cemeteries and perhaps patient graves on the grounds, but as the time of recording, there have been no efforts to perform any historical surveys at the site of the Jemison Center, like there have been done at the Old Bryce Hospital campus. There have been no restoration efforts either. Jemison Center is slowly being reclaimed by nature and time. The reason of that isn't immediately known, but speculation as to why is easy enough to come up with. One research paper I uncovered states that in 1902, Searcy Hospital, located in Mobile, Alabama, opened and housed African American patients. All but 60 African American patients from Bryce Hospital were loaded onto a train and sent to Searcy Hospital. The speculation from that particular researcher is that the 60 that remained at Bryce was due to the work the hospital wanted them to do. Interestingly enough, the Partlow State School, also mentioned earlier in the class action lawsuit, was known to practice eugenics and forced sterilization of their patients. Most of their history and stories have been lost to time, and any and all physical evidence was lost when it was completely demolished, only to become the grounds for the new and still operating location of Bryce Hospital. With all of these locations being within only a mile or two of each other, it isn't a stretch to think that those practices existed amongst the entire campus. I think it's funny that, with the exception of Searcy Hospital, Partlow, Jemison, all these, quote, separate institutes, all operated on the same grounds and under the same governance of Bryce Hospital. But now I'm just getting angry. Yes, Bryce Hospital is still in operation. Yes, Jemison still sits ignored and abandoned. But when you see the articles and reports of ghost hunters and thrill seekers talking about their time spent at haunted Old Bryce Hospital, remember, they are talking about the Jemison Center, the horrendous and neglected African American wing of Bryce Hospital. Bryce Hospital proper was reclaimed and restored to its former architectural glory, while it's the Jemison Center that sits forgotten, losing its identity even to locals who insist on still calling it Old Bryce. The intrigue of wandering spirits of former mental patients draws people to the location over and over again. Trespassing there is prohibited, but that doesn't seem to matter to some. The location has been vandalized beyond recognition, not to mention the building itself is beyond disrepair. But hints of its former life still remains. Mattresses still exist there beneath piles of rubble from the collapsing structure. There are reports of ghostly wails, footsteps, voices, the sounds of doors opening and closing, even though there is hardly a door left standing at the site. But for those that have been there, do you even know where you've been? Do you know the history of the location? Were you hearing the voices and cries of mental patients that are too confused to move on to the next life? Or are you hearing the wails and pleas of help from those that were kept there for other reasons? Modern slavery. Spirits that were so broken down in life that they still will not leave. I'm not trying to discourage those that view themselves as paranormal investigators. I'm just saying, know where you're visiting. Know who you're potentially trying to summon. Perhaps then, that will change your outlook on things.